incidence of sexual violence has skyrocketed, and just in 2008, the UN Population Fund, which I worked for the previous year, reported 18,000 cases of rape. That's in 2008, the year that the Security Council issued a resolution on this topic. In a more recent report published in the Journal of American Medical Association, there's an estimated number of 1.3 million women and 760,000 men as survivors of sexual violence. I'm going to just give you some more stats, too. The Eastern Congo Initiative states that there's nearly 1,100 rapes reported per month, with an average of 36 women and children raped per day, 160 women raped per week in North and South Kivu, and that in some areas of Eastern DRC, 66% of women have been victims of some form of sexual violence. These numbers are totally outrageous. But what is it about these numbers that should really, what is it about, besides just the numbers, that should really, cause us to motivate us to work on this issue? Just aside from the pure statistics, the nature of rape is outrageously brutal. When I say rape, I'm talking gang rape, public rape, forced incest, and the rape of victims ranging from infants to 80-year-olds. That's, I think, something that really alerted me to the fact that this is not just about power and control and all the other things that we associate rape to be, but that it is part and parcel of conflict, and that this is something new, and it totally demarcates a new form of violence that the Congolese societies have described as unheard of before the war, unheard forms of violence. Attacks, just to be thorough, attacks have included mutilation of the genitalia, rape, shooting of the cervix, rape stabbing combinations, sometimes undertaken as family members have been tied up and forced to watch their families, the women of their families, or even boys. And that brings me to the point that women are not the only survivors of rape, that in fact there is also another gender and men, and that's something that has really just not been addressed in terms of treatment and response to survivors, but also thinking about ways for them to access support. So who is it that is perpetrating, when we think of this, who is it that is carrying out these sort of tactics? They've been identified across all the armies, all the militias. Gangs have attacked their own communities and local police forces. There's a very strong critique of the national military policy, which has absorbed members of former militias, like the CNDPs David was mentioning earlier, and also earlier this morning. And from there, not really holding these perpetrators account to what they've perpetrated on women and girls. The LRA and other militias roving and has committed outrageous atrocities in the last couple of months and also this summer. These are like 300 killings, which is a total other thing too. When you think about how you measure sexual violence, an indicator, this might be a little technical, but there's a way to measure it by having survivors come and report and saying that they have experienced an incidence of sexual violence, but there's also people who have died on account of being raped. And so how do statistics measure that? That's something that I know was totally very difficult to wrap your head around, and people are trying to. So when it comes to this rape as a weapon of war slogan that we hear often, It's important to realize that without confronting and accounting for the conflict, you won't address sexual violence. That is rooted in the conflict for resources and for power. And that it's used to control and subjugate local populations as militias and the army rove through and try to profit from the mines. And it's deeply intertwined with ethnicity and contested ownership of land. So some of the consequences of GBV, particularly sexual violence, is STIs, unwanted pregnancies, traumatic fistula. If you guys have heard of the Ponzi Hospital, you've probably heard of Dr. Tanini Kwegi, and that is a center that's been established to support rehabilitation and reconstruction, provide those services for women who have survived sexual violence, and death, as I had mentioned also, but also social stigma. For a woman that's been impregnated by her rapist, communities have been known to refer to that child, and the mother sometimes herself as a snake. The baby is a snake, and so there's tremendous impacts on community, and that's why I have community trauma on here, because the devastating impact of sexual violence also relates to community cohesion and trust, and breaking down all those institutions and having massive displacement, massive populations displaced, and collapse of basic services, destruction. It trickles down to affect the whole community. And poverty. I think sexual violence impedes economic development, because we know that the mineral industry is a huge potential way to generate money, but also agriculture. And as I was talking with some of the people here earlier, agriculture requires you to till fields and then wait and then be able to I'm not really good with agriculture in terms, but if you're constantly moving and leaving your land, then you're not really cultivating your crops. And so, yes. In terms of treatment and response, there's legal, medical, psychosocial, security, and livelihood interventions that have been promoted by the international community, and this is part and parcel of the multi-sectoral approach, which you'll often see in a lot of international humanitarian organizations stressing. So in terms of emerging trends, I think it's important to point out the recent research has identified the appropriation of sexual violence by civilians. One study put out by the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative points to a 17-fold increase in violence perpetrated by civilians. So this is not armed combatants. And so what this really shows us is that we have to also address and think of sexual violence on a very individual level, and think about what it means to have, what it means for communities to have experienced and have been exposed to high levels of violence for the last 15 years, and how that manifests in community relationships and social relationships. The role of men, both as perpetrators and as advocates for women, is something that is currently also being researched. And it's really important to analyze the role of men as advocates for women's rights, because when it comes to social stigma, it would be interesting to see the supportive mechanisms in which men can build to support women who have survived incidences of violence, as opposed to just kicking them out of the house. Recently, there's also been, if you track the news, high-level arrests and trials of people who have been implicated with these mass rapes that have happened in the last 6 months, which is very promising, because the culture of impunity, I know earlier we talked about how that facilitates conflict, corruption in the conflict in the mining industry, but it also facilitates just an outrageous number of criminal activities